back to Block TV. It's time now for Hodl with Hedl, a chance to zoom out for a moment and take a wider perspective on some of the heady issues that dominate the crypto markets as a whole. And to guide us on this journey of discovery, we're joined by early Bitcoiner and thought leader Dan Held, now Director of Business Development at Kraken. Dan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks again for having me.
All right, so kick off this week's conversation. We're going to have a bit of a conversation today about Bitcoin banks, a bit of a controversial term still in the industry, but I think we're going to have a chance here to boil it down. Now, the kickoff point that I know you wanted to launch from on this is the idea originally envisioned by Hal Finney, the first man to ever receive Bitcoin from Satoshi Nakamoto, who made a post back in 2010 talking about his vision for what he saw the role of banks for in the future of Bitcoin. Can you help break down this idea a little bit of what Hal was talking about at the time, remembering this was back in 2010, and see how that vision, we'll eventually see how that vision stacks up with now?
Yeah, Hal Finney, which by the way, he wasn't just the first person to transact with Satoshi, he was the first person that we know of that was mining at that the first day that Bitcoin came out. Hal Finney was also one of the only people that positively received Bitcoin on the cryptographer mailing list. Most people in the mailing list, if you go read it, are pretty negative when Satoshi presents Bitcoin. They don't think it'll work. But Hal really, Hal has his reservations, but he's one of the first ones to be positive about it. So, Hal's an incredibly important character in the Bitcoin space. Some of his work predicated Bitcoin. And he was a really influential and I think really inspiring individual where he had an ailment later down the road that limited his motor functionality. And he was programming, I think, with like the use of very special tools where he had a program, I think, letter by letter, where he lost the function of using his hands. So, Hal's an incredibly inspirational figure, an incredible thought leader in the space. And one of the first to go really sink his teeth into Bitcoin when it first came out. And what he saw pretty early on was that there's no way to scale Bitcoin on layer one, that you have to scale it on layers above that it would be scalable on like layer two or via centralized solutions that he called Bitcoin banks. And so Hal pretty early on in 2010 realized the need for Lightning, and where he talks about that layer two functionality. And 10 years later, we saw that finally happen. Or about 9-10 years later, we saw that finally happen. And then something that we haven't seen happen yet, but we're starting to see little inklings of it, is Bitcoin, or our Bitcoin banks. So Bitcoin banks are centralized solutions where it closely resembles something that we might look at like an exchange or BlockFi or Genesis Capital, where there's additional services that depositors are given when they deposit at this institution. Now, to be clear, Kraken right now, we don't offer any of those any sort of lending services within Kraken, but we do offer margin trading. So, some exchanges like Bitfinex, they have both lending and margin trading where if you're a depositor at that exchange, you can lend your Bitcoin to the margin traders and earn a yield on that. Similarly with BlockFi, you can deposit Bitcoins on BlockFi and earn a yield there as well. Now with both, you are taking on risk. They are taking your coins and either lending them to margin traders, or they're taking those coins outside of that system and lending it to large counterparties to facilitate their trading activities. But those are the first inklings we're seeing of Bitcoin banks, where you can take your Bitcoin that you're hodling, and now you won't be hodling when you do this, but you'll be earning a yield on it, which may increase your affinity to keep hodling. But what it does is it essentially resembles a whole entire financial system built on Bitcoin, which is fantastic. I think a lot of Bitcoiners have an aversion to banking, but banking itself is not the issue. It's too big to fail banks. It's having central banks that's the real problem. Lending and borrowing is a normal activity that will occur with Bitcoin, no matter if we want it to happen or not.
And I want to as well address a specific point that was sort of raised by Hal in his original post back in 2010. Now, you spoke of the second layer, which has come to be the Lightning Network in its current form, being on top of the Bitcoin network to help with some of those scalability issues. But he also makes a specific point there towards the end where he says, Bitcoin transactions by private individuals will be as rare as well as Bitcoin-based purchases are today. Now, obviously, talking back in 2010, that was exceptionally rare. Today, perhaps, even though there are so many more people involved in the Bitcoin and the crypto ecosystem as a whole, those transactions are still, considered relatively rare given the size of the market as a whole. Do you think that we are heading towards, when we talk about Bitcoin as a store of value or as a means of exchange and an actual functional currency, do you think Hal was right in the sense of Bitcoin will function more in that store of value context in a way of making larger scale transactions, but day to day we'll be using more, whether it be the Lightning Network or other sort of mechanisms to utilize our crypto?
Yeah, I think Hal realized that settlement on layer one will be a rare activity, whereas settlement with layer two will be something that I think people will touch directly. It's sort of like I think we oftentimes forget, we zoom so close to the metal, to how the protocol works, that we often forget that most people barely know how their car works or their cell phone works or the refrigerator works. They just press buttons and it works, right? So, for those who want the settlement guarantee over large assets, so like when I move $1 million in Bitcoin, I want to have that guarantee that it'll be final. And those sort of transactions, I see like, $10,000 plus transactions are the ones that will find the most value being settled on layer one, with the smaller ones being settled on layer two. And that, those settlements on layer two require a tiny, tiny, tiny bit more trust, but not that much more trust. And so these layers kind of resemble layers of trust. With layer one, I don't trust anyone at all. Layer two, I trust a very, very small amount, and like layer three and above would be incremental layers of trust. So, I think Hal understood that there's only so many transactions that can fit in a block. And when that happens, that there can only be certain types of transactions that will be settled on layer one. And so I think we're seeing that happen in the Bitcoin space where, if you look at the median transaction size, that's increasing over time as these speculative bubbles continue to boom and bust. And you look at fees as well, and while fees aren't what I consider that bad, certainly in the future they will be higher, and that's not a good or a bad thing. It merely indicates that people find value in transacting on layer one, and they find value in that thermodynamic guarantee that proof of work gives you on layer one for that transaction.
I suppose as well, to put things in perspective, as I suppose you attempted to do, you just did then as well, in the world in which we currently live in, the financial marketplace we live in, there are those layers of trust required, whether it be financing on your car, whether it be a small Visa payment made to a particular store that you go into. These transactions don't happen instantly, and there is an element of trust and time that takes place. So I suppose, as you say, people are used to that idea. It's not totally foreign to the current financial system, correct?
Right, and I think, I'm all about privacy and security, and that we should transact in a near trustless manner, or as trust minimized manner as possible. And I think Bitcoin is largely executing along that path. And I think Bitcoiners are realistic as to, we can't have everyone participate in getting their transaction in that same block space, and we can't all pay 1 penny. That doesn't make any sense. It's like I'd like us all to use a highway, and I'd like the highway to be infinitely large, and I refuse to pay anything larger than a penny to drive on it. That's just not how the real world works. And I think Bitcoiners are the most realistic blockchain in the space in terms of analyzing their block space and understanding how that block space will be utilized in the future. And Hal Finney 10 years ago saw this happening, and he was largely correct.
And now let's talk about, bring this sort of conversation into the present day, as it were, and speak about the services that do exist, those ones you mentioned that give bank-like services now in terms of building the ecosystem. We're talking BlockFi, Genesis Capital, Celsius Network, all these organizations that are attempting to give bank-like services within the crypto space. Now, there have been some issues brought up regarding the capacity to do this, whether it be, as you say, the security concerns about holding onto the crypto itself, whether it be issues of fractional reserving, where you risk having a fractional reserve system that puts more than 21 million Bitcoin into the system by nature of the way banking works. Do you think that given enough time and given enough structure put in place, we can have truly functional banks that work solely within the crypto sphere that sort of match their fiat counterparts?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't see why banks wouldn't work with crypto. I think a lot of people have an aversion to it just because they've seen what happened with the legacy financial system. And there were early attempts at this in 2013, 2014 that were scams. I would say 99% of the crypto space is largely unsavory individuals in terms of how they operate business-wise. So to survive this long in this space, I've met a lot of people and I've seen a lot of businesses come and go. So I understand Bitcoiners' hesitancy towards trusting someone in any capacity. With Bitcoin payments and Bitcoin lending happening on a transparent ledger, in the future, this can be really, really beneficial for risk modeling. So you could, for example, if you banked with a Bitcoin bank and you lent your money out to them, they could show you on chain who the counterparty was, how much was lent to them, and then the payments being made monthly in Bitcoin, which then that means you could audit transparently how much money has been lent out, what the reserve ratio of the bank is, how much money is on deposit, how much money has been lent out, and understand who those counterparties are. And I think we've never had that sort of transparent, transparent relationship before with our banking infrastructure. And I think that is really, really beneficial for depositors who, look, you can hold your Bitcoin, not your keys, not your coins, you can hodl it on your own. This is taking incremental levels of risk above what you're taking by hodling your coins, which, by the way, hodling your coins is not a risk-free endeavor. I almost every old Bitcoiner I know has lost Bitcoins through managing their own private keys. So, not your keys, not your coins, I think is an aspirational endeavor, and I think really holds true to what Bitcoin is about. But I would say, not your keys, not your coins, and be careful. And so when you deposit at one of these, Bitcoin-esque banks, you are taking on not only the risk of them managing their private keys, but their operational risk and their counterparty risk, who they're lending their Bitcoins to. So that's what you're being compensated for in the terms of a yield. And to be clear, that's like a lot of layers of risk on top of that. And so only through time will we see how well these coins have been lent out. But we're starting to see this industry be created, and I think it's really fascinating because you could see potentially exchanges become this. You could see a combination of BlockFi and miners potentially coming up with new mining contracts or new mining derivatives. And so I think this is a really interesting space. It's something that I think we should be open to embracing. I know, like I said, I know Bitcoiners are a little bit scared of looking at kind of things that resemble the existing financial infrastructure, but this is a whole new world, and we have to approach it and see what can be built.
I mean, it's interesting you raise that point about a whole new world, because it seems to me, and of course many in this industry would say that's the whole point, but it's such a paradigm shift, particularly on those issues of what you were talking about with transparency, counterparty risk, being aware of that, being able to audit and manage your own counterparty risk and transparency when it comes to banking and lending services that exist because of the obviously distributed nature of a true permissionless blockchain. It's a powerful thing, but I wonder if it'll be able to match in terms of scale and profitability, in your estimate, the existing financial system, or will this sort of continue to be a niche service that exists on the side for those who are more interested in working within the crypto space?
Yeah. I mean, the fact that we're on a TV show is pretty cool to me. Back when I started, the fact that we have crypto TV shows is pretty awesome. Back when I started my first product, Zero Block, in 2013, CoinDesk didn't exist. And so we built the first newsfeed aggregator in the space. And at that time, I manually curated the feed, and we would scrape our Bitcoin subreddit, the hot thread. So that was that was the primary source of news. So to put it all in perspective, we've come quite a long ways. And yeah, it is niche compared to the mainstream financial markets, but it's a new parallel financial system that can be accessed by anyone in the world. And I'm that's where I'm really excited. Is I don't see. I see the small nature of what might be perceived as a small market now could be a much larger one later. And I think those opportunities are what make me excited about going to work every day, is the impact that we can drive, the being part of something going, from 1 to 10, I think is super thrilling. I had that experience early in crypto. I had that experience at Uber at scale, where we were going from 20 million to 100 million monthly active users in every country in the world, or nearly every major country in the world. And with Bitcoin, I think we're about to enter that same phase where we go from, what's estimated to be 20 to 40 million Bitcoin hodlers to maybe 400 million or 500 million. And I think that's a super thrilling time to be part of this community.
So then if we could wrap it all in a nice little bow and sort of package it neatly, what would you say is your overarching takeaway on the issue of crypto banking?
Bitcoin banks aren't scary, but don't trust, verify.
Succinct, well put. Dan Held, I'd like to thank you so much for hodling with Hedl this week. An interesting topic to be sure, and there'll be plenty more to come. So stay with us in the weeks ahead for more in news and information. Of course, stay with us at blocktv.com. I'm Ashley Westropp Evans. Thanks for watching.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter.